If you want to support independent content like this show, the PlayStation Podcast Sacred Symbols, the Retro Podcast Knockback, and more, and get perks for doing so, please consider subscribing to Colin's Last Stand on Patreon at patreon.com/Colin's Last Stand. Your support is essential. Thank you. Konami's Castlevania franchise has been running for more than 3 consecutive decades, but if you're a newcomer, there's something important you need to understand. The series is essentially, though not totally, split into 2 halves, hailing from 2 separate eras, revolving around unique approaches to gameplay and presentation. On the one hand, there's the traditional style of Castlevania game that began back in 1986 and remained prominent through the mid-90s, a style predicated around brutally difficult play, linear design, and unforgiving combat. On the other hand, you have the aptly titled Metroidvania style, which began in 1997 with Symphony of the Night and ran up through 2008's Order of Ecclesia, though you could make the argument that it actually kinda sorta began with Simon's Quest nearly a decade earlier. Either way, this approach ramps down the brutal old-school difficulty and ramps up the RPG mechanics, non-linearity, and exploration. And yeah, there are games that fit into neither camp, like Castlevania 64 or Lords of Shadow, but for the most part, we define Castlevania using these simple differentiators. When it comes to the recently released Castlevania Anniversary Collection, available on PlayStation 4, Xbox One, Switch, and PC, you're receiving 8 games squarely from the former era. While this may be disappointing to some, after all, Symphony of the Night is widely considered one of the great games of all time, and the decade-long sequence of Metroidvania Castlevania games is super good. I'm pleased to report that the Castlevania Anniversary Collection nonetheless delivers faithful ports of some classic must-play retro favorites, all in a convenient and appropriately priced package that admittedly placed little emphasis on frills, special options, and noteworthy new features. Within the Anniversary Collection, you'll find 3 NES games in the form of Castlevania, Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest, and Castlevania 3 Dracula's Curse, 2 Game Boy ROMs called Castlevania The Adventure and Castlevania 2 Belmont's Revenge, the Super Nintendo launch-era classic Super Castlevania 4, the underplayed mid-gen Genesis game Castlevania Bloodlines, and perhaps most peculiar of all, a Famicom Castlevania spin-off that never saw an official release in the West until now, called Kid Dracula. If you're totally unfamiliar with Castlevania, all you really need to know is that you typically, though certainly not always, play as a whip-wielding protagonist from the storied Belmont clan of vampire hunters. Dastardly forces of evil usually spawn out of a twisted gothic castle that appears in the Eastern European countryside every now and again, and it's up to you to destroy them and ultimately Count Dracula, the top baddie that controls the chaos in order to achieve his unholy goals. Glazed over everything is a thick patina of classic frights and monsters like bats, zombies, and other wily creatures of the night, and certain enemies and bosses alike, like the dreaded Medusa heads or the cloth-shooting mummies, are Castlevania icons that you'll see over and over again. The stories are all interconnected. One thing Konami excelled at even back in the day was putting everything on a timeline and placing tethers from one game to the next, but really, you don't need to be equipped with much knowledge to sit down and play. In reality, it's all pretty surface level. During these eras, we were used to using our imaginations to get more out of limited experiences, so it makes a lot of sense through a nostalgic lens. The beauty of the 8 Castlevania games in this package is that they all feel like they belong together, even when they hail from different hardware and different hardware generations. They all feel coherent both in their initial release sequence and in how they scatter through the Castlevania timeline. The trilogy of NES games is probably the most iconic of the bunch for most players, particularly when it comes to the original Castlevania and Castlevania 3, the latter of which is widely considered to be the finest of the classic fare. But the Game Boy games, while tragically short, were also fun for me to go back to for the first time in many years, though they were far more difficult than I recall. Meanwhile, I was shocked that I didn't remember Castlevania Bloodlines more fondly, having not played it to any extent since I was in high school. But as earlier mentioned, the strangest inclusion in this anthology is undoubtedly Kid Dracula, which launched only in Japan in 1990, and has remained an oddity relegated to most Western players' emulators until right now. It's cute and it's fun to play something new from the era, especially when it's interconnected to such a classic franchise. It's also the easiest of these original games, though such a statement is entirely relative. The original Castlevania can be beaten in about 20 minutes by an experienced player after all, while its sequel, Simon's Quest, totes multiple endings depending on how quickly you beat it, an almost unheard of feat for the time. Either way, you can spam save states here if you want. It also goes without saying, but these games are aesthetic masterpieces too. The Castlevania franchise's pixel art, animations, enemy designs, locales, and backgrounds are iconic for a reason. I continue to be blown away by how well it all holds up through the expectations of the time, and how pleasing to the eye the color palettes are. Likewise, the soundtracks hold up to this day, regardless of which game, console, or handheld you're referring to. You'd only need a couple of hands to count the amount of 8-bit and 16-bit games that have better tracks than your typical Castlevania title. Unlike the truly and astonishingly bare-bones Castlevania Requiem, which brought the aforementioned Symphony of the Night and its prequel Rondo of Blood to PS4 in the most barren way possible, the Castlevania Anniversary Collection is thankfully a more thoughtful affair. The only old-school series I love more than Castlevania is Mega Man, and though we rarely get new games of note, one of the strange benefits of being a big Mega Man fan is that publisher Capcom has actually given us quite a bit to chew on, in the form of interviews, concept art, and more over the years. Konami has been far less forthcoming with Castlevania, and though this compilation is significantly less impressive than Capcom's 4 Mega Man and Mega Man X Anniversary collections in this regard, it's still brimming with extras by Konami's typically far lazier standards. It's super cool to see high-res box art for all of the games, some neat write-ups that describe their stories, and even concept art and planning documents, which are especially rare for Castlevania nerds to lay eyes upon. Unfortunately, these extras are presented in digital book-like form with cumbersome controls, making it all harder to enjoy than it has to be. And there really could have and should have been more for each game, like enemy indices and the like, that really would have made the whole package pop even more. Likewise, and I know this isn't a complaint for a lot of people, so forgive me ahead of time, but I'm really disappointed by the lack of a platinum trophy in this game, which will only affect PS4 consumers. One of the really neat components of collections and re-releases is giving experienced players and newcomers alike the ability to participate in their specific hardware's achievement metagame. And Konami put literally no thought into this list, similar to Capcom's classic Mega Man anthologies. But the lack of a platinum trophy is particularly notable because this collection is one of 3 Konami-themed compilations announced, and the first of the collections, based upon classic Konami arcade games, has a platinum trophy. So what's with the lack of consistency? I'll keep beating this drum even if I know most of you don't care. Sorry, I guess. But that pernicious issue aside, I consider the Castlevania Anniversary Collection a success. The 8 experiences this collection has to offer are amongst the most iconic and important of their respective generations and hardware, and must-plays for those interested in the storied and dynamic history of the 2D platformer. While we anticipate what will hopefully be the eventual launch of a Metroidvania Castlevania collection, this anthology represents a major step in the right direction for a publisher that has so many amazing classics to draw upon, but little goodwill with which to give them to the world. The upside to the presentational downsides, as it were, is that hopefully Konami gets another crack at doing this one more time at some point in the future, and gives us all the goodies and extras that Castlevania fans so desperately crave, in a package that's perhaps a bit easier and more intuitive to explore. In the meantime, though, you can't go wrong playing these games and taking a journey through our medium's humble origins of horror, gore, and pure gameplay.